Okay, so you've been really diving deep into this whole world of faith and technology,
Yeah,
online services, apps, all of it.
it's fascinating stuff.
It is fascinating. You've got all these notes, articles, and we're going to unpack it all,
Mm.
figure out how people are balancing, uh, you know, their beliefs with this whole digital age we're living in.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see how, this isn't just a one-way street. We're seeing how technology is actually changing how people worship, how they connect with each other, even how they wrestle with some of the big questions of faith.
Yeah, totally. So from your notes, one of the things that really jumped out was this whole idea of online church. And I think a lot of people are still like, online church, how does that even work?
Right.
And you even mentioned how the pandemic really kind of forced everyone to figure that out, right?
Absolutely. It was a huge experiment, and you pointed out some really interesting pros and cons that experts were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of unavoidable for a while there.
Exactly. And that's what's so interesting because, on the one hand, it made faith so much more accessible, right? People who couldn't physically get to a church, whether it's because of distance or maybe they were dealing with an illness, even something as simple as childcare,
Why?
suddenly they could participate.
It's true. I remember those early days of the pandemic, and even my like 80-year-old grandmother was suddenly figuring out Zoom to watch her church service.
And that's huge. In your notes, you actually mentioned a sociologist who was studying this and found that engagement actually went up, especially among people with disabilities. There was this sense of, wow, I'm actually being included in a way that I haven't been before.
Yeah, it really levels the playing field in a way that traditional services just haven't always been able to.
Right, exactly. And I think this is where it gets really interesting. You also pointed out this other side of it. Like, it's not a perfect solution. You can't just like flip a switch and suddenly everything's virtual. There's something about that in-person connection. And you even had this quote, I think it was from a Dr. Jennifer Jones.
Yeah, might be.
She said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something like, online services are great as a connection point, but you miss out on that tangible sense of community that you get from like actually being in the same room, sharing a meal together, even just like, the hugs after the service.
It's so true. Like, you can download a sermon, you can watch it on your phone, but you can't download that feeling of community,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. And that seems to be a big takeaway from a lot of the experts you were looking at. Okay, technology can do a lot, but it can't replicate everything.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that actually, I think, segues perfectly into the next thing I wanted to ask you about from your notes, which is this whole world of apps and podcasts.
Oh, yeah, the library in your pocket idea.
Yes. Which I love, by the way. It's amazing how many resources are literally right at our fingertips now. I mean, were there any specific apps or podcasts that jumped out at you while you were doing research?
You seemed really drawn to the meditation and mindfulness apps, especially the ones that were like rooted in different spiritual traditions. And I see a note here about a podcast you were checking out, Faith and Current Events.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
That one seems to really fit with like your interest in how faith and like what's happening in the world, how those things bump up against each other.
Definitely. I mean, I remember reading somewhere that there are like over 4,000 apps now that are categorized as religious. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It's a lot.
But then you also mentioned, and I think this is something that we all struggle with, this feeling of information overload. Like at a
Yeah.
certain point, it's just too much, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that comes up a lot in what you were reading, this idea that we need to be really careful, really discerning about what we're consuming, especially when it comes to faith.
It's like you almost need to have faith in your sources, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And you underlined a passage in one of the articles that really stuck out to me. It was talking about the importance of not just passively consuming information, like we can't just scroll and expect to grow spiritually.
Yeah.
And you had some good strategies for how to deal with that, like cross-referencing information, not just relying on one source, but seeing what other people are saying, especially people who've been studying this stuff for a long time, theologians, trusted institutions,
Right.
even just like talking about it with other people in your faith community. That can be so valuable just to have those conversations and process it together.
Yeah, it's not just about what you're taking in, but it's also, like you said, who you're talking to, how you're processing it. It's all connected.
Totally. And that actually leads into, I think, the last big thing I want to touch on from your notes, which is this desire to use technology mindfully.
Oh, yeah.
Like, how can we use these amazing tools for spiritual growth without letting them become just another distraction?
Because it's so easy to let that happen, right?
It really is. It's so easy to get sucked in. But one of the most practical tips that I saw come up again and again was this idea of unplugging, like actually creating some space between ourselves and our devices.
Yes.
Like creating sacred spaces where you're not constantly bombarded with notifications and news feeds and all of that. You even circled a quote about setting aside specific times for prayer and reflection and actually putting your phone in another room during those times.
It's funny, we set boundaries with so many things in our lives,
Yeah.
but we rarely do that with our phones, right? Like,
Right.
they have access to us 24/7.
Exactly. And I think that's where this all ties back together. Technology can be an incredible tool, but it shouldn't replace those real world connections, those practices that ground us.
Right.
It's like what we were saying about online versus in person. We still need that human connection, that time for quiet reflection. We have to be intentional about how we're letting technology into our lives.
It's all about balance. That's the key takeaway here. Using these tools to enhance our spiritual lives, not to dominate them.
100%. And if there's one thing that really stood out to me from everything you were looking at, it's this idea of discernment. Like, we have so much power at our fingertips now, but we have to be thoughtful about how we use it. It's not about rejecting technology, it's about figuring out how it can best serve our own individual spiritual journeys.
And that's such a great point to end on. What's one small change that you, listening, can make this week to be just a little bit more mindful, a little bit more intentional about how technology fits into your own spiritual life?